It was a few years ago, actually several years ago. My wife, Margie, and three of our children, Sarah, Naomi, and Nathan, were driving back from Toronto to Atlanta. And Sarah was about to undergo her second surgery. Actually, she had just had that surgery in Toronto. We had taken her to that city for a particular surgeon who had operated on her earlier. It was very microscopic, very important surgery right in the inner ear. He had to get the outer ear, get through the middle ear, in fact, had to even remove the eardrum. And so Sarah had gone through an awful lot of trauma. Before we'd gone through the surgery, there was the danger that she might be totally paralyzed on that side of her face, which thankfully did not happen. So we were driving back, celebrating, enjoying all the good news. And we were visiting my brother-in-law, who's a minister in Akron, Ohio. He and his children and our family were out on a mini golf course having a fun day. Four of us parents were talking when all of a sudden my little son Nathan came running and said, Daddy, hurry, please come, Sarah's hurt. And dropped everything we were doing and ran over in Sarah's direction, wondering if something had happened to that bandaged up left ear. And as Margie and I ran towards her, we were greeted by a sight that, as long as we live, I don't believe we'll ever forget. She was bent over, covering her right eye with her hand, and the blood was just pouring out through that hand. And we looked around, and her cousin looked very fearful there. It was something totally unintentional. He was swinging that golf club of his, and unknowingly, Sarah was standing right behind him. And he took a full-blooded swing, and the toe of that club landed right in the socket of Sarah's right eye. And as we looked at that and saw our daughter already bandaged up on the left ear and bleeding profusely from the right eye, a sight we did not even want to directly engage, I wondered if the sight was going to survive. We put her into an ambulance, and we were hurriedly going through busy traffic, taking her to the hospital. And as I sat in that ambulance, I thought of the many times I am asked a question, either from the floor, sometimes in friendly, sometimes in hostile fashion. How can you justify the existence of an all-powerful and an all-loving God when there is so much of evil and suffering in this world? I have faced that question head-on many times. After we had gone through that ordeal and much thought had been given to it, I was thinking of the converse of that. And over the years have pondered this question, exactly the reverse, a question that we very seldom ask of ourselves. We want to talk about God and his existence, dealing with the problem of pain. But a subject that you hardly ever encounter is God and the problem of pleasure. How do we understand life with all of its offerings, with all that God has provided for us, and yet with all the seductions that abound? I have lived an itinerant life for 27 years. I spent half of my life in a hotel room. I've had all kinds of approaches made on the road. Some staggered you for a moment. Some shocked you that you even realized it would weigh in as heavily upon you. And the allurements, the enticements bombard you in every direction. Whether you open a magazine, or whether you're looking at the television, or you're reading a newspaper, or sitting in some quiet hotel room somewhere from here, someone is there to offer you something that you know you had better have a worldview with which to respond to. Because if you do not, it will waylay you. Many writers have dealt with this struggle we now have, coming to the tail end of the 20th century. Neil Postman, professor at the University of New York, in a fascinating book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, in the preface says this, comparing George Orwell's book to Huxley's book, A Brave New World. Listen to what he says in the introduction. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would reduce to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumblepuppy. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. And then Postman goes on to add this postscript that his book is about the possibility that Huxley and not Orwell was right. How do you deal with the problem of pleasure? How do you cope with the seduction of power, of lust, of greed, of pride? And we all face it within this mortal frame of ours. And the most fascinating thing about this problem of pleasure is that those who have experienced it the most are the ones who ask the question most poignantly, how do you come to grips with this? Listen to Minerth and Meyer writing in their book, Happiness is a Choice. As a further point of clarification, Dr. Minerth and I are convinced that many people do choose happiness but never obtain it. The reason for this is that even though they choose to be happy, they seek for inner peace and joy in the wrong places. They seek for happiness in materialism and do not find it. They seek for joy in sexual prowess, but end up with fleeting pleasures and bitter long-term disappointments. They seek inner fulfillment by obtaining positions of power in corporations and government, or even in their own families by exercising excessive control, but they remain completely unfulfilled. I have had millionaire businessmen come to my office and tell me that they have big houses, yachts, condominiums in Colorado, nice children, a beautiful mistress, an unsuspecting wife, secure corporate positions, but with suicidal tendencies. They have everything the world has to offer except one thing, inner peace and joy. They come to my office as a last resort, begging me to help them conquer the urge to kill themselves. Why? The answers are not simple. The human mind and emotions are a very complex, dynamic system. It was Solomon, who had all that the human eye desired, who penned the most powerful words on the search for an answer in pleasure. Listen to how he words it in the book of Ecclesiastes. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure really accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself than the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. Yet in all of this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and yet this was the reward for all my labor. When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. That qualifier is very important, my dear friend. Under the sun. It is the Hebraism which literally means outside of God. If you lock God out of your pursuits, everything becomes a chasing after the wind and meaningless. When Jack Higgins, the author of many novels, one of the best known being The Eagle Has Landed, was asked for words of wisdom in an interview, this is what he said to the question, what is it you now know that you'd wish you'd known as a younger man? Higgins did not bat an eyelid and said this, I wish I had known then what I know now, that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. I wish I'd known then what I know now, that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. Boris Becker, after being interviewed from his second Wimbledon victory, was asked a very simple question, what his greatest challenge was in life, and his answer was to keep from committing suicide. News reporter from CNN, Nick Charles, was visiting my office shortly after he'd done an interview with Deion Sanders. And Charles, who has become a good friend of mine, was sitting across the table talking, and he said, I think you'd be interested in knowing what Deion had to say to a question I posed to him. Why did he choose to become a Christian so recently? Deion looked him across the table and he said, Nick, it happened the night we won the Super Bowl. I just finished ordering my Lamborghini. And I lay in bed there thinking every goal I had ever attained had now been reached, and yet I was emptier than ever before. That was the night I got on my knees and said, God, only you are big enough to fill this heart of mine. You see, ladies and gentlemen, G.K. Chesterton made an astute remark, and I want you to hear it. Meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Think about that. Meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. When you have exhausted that last dream and you find it has left you rather barren or empty. The question, of course, comes before you and before me. We may be at different levels of enticements. Whatever yours is, whatever mine is. The question boils down to this. Has God given us something concrete in His Word to help us navigate through this minefield? He could not possibly be against pleasure. He called everything good when He made it. In fact, the scriptures sustain that at His right hand are pleasures forevermore. God is on the side of pleasure which is good and perpetuates itself. I want to give to you 3 simple principles, and I trust these will be as helpful to you as they have been to me. I have etched these upon my conscience, and they have been very helpful as I have come to crossroad moments. And I will give you the passage of scripture. We won't take time to read it because some of them don't leap out at you. Obviously, you just about have to pursue the idea in order to find what is concealed there. The first one is this. In Judges chapter 7, Gideon is about to come up against the Midianites. And of course, Gideon does what any good general would have done. He tries to bring together the mightiest army that he could muster in order to face this daunting enemy. So Gideon gets them together, gets a good 30,000, 32,000 strong army. And God is in conversation with Gideon and says, Gideon, you've really got a problem, and the problem is that your army is too big. I do not want that many people going out for this battle. And Gideon says, how can that be? The Midianites are so strong. God says, will you reduce that army down, please? So Gideon goes and somehow finds a method to bring it down to size. And now he comes down with about 10,000. And he goes to the Lord and says, is this all right? God says, no, you've still got too many. He says, here's what I want you to do, Gideon. I want you to take these boys who are joining you in this fight, go by a river that you're going to encounter very quickly, and give them the opportunity to have a drink before they move on to the battle. And in the way they drink that water, I'm going to separate for you the ones that I want you to take and the ones that I want you to leave behind. Now, everyone in these 10,000 was completely unsuspecting as they went over to that river to drink that water. And the reason is this. Here is principle number 1. Anything that refreshes you without distracting from, diminishing, or destroying your final goal is a legitimate pleasure. Anything that refreshes you without distracting you from, diminishing, or destroying your final goal is a legitimate pleasure. John Wesley's mother had 19 children. And John was a unique individual. If you have ever studied Wesley's biography, here's what will come to the fore. He traveled 250,000 miles, most of them by horseback, preaching the word of God. He preached over 40,000 sermons in his lifetime. He worked with many, many different languages, wrote massive pieces of literature. At the age of 83, he enters this in his journal, that he is angry with his doctor because his doctor wouldn't let him preach more than 14 times a week. And at the age of 86, he says this: laziness is slowly creeping in. There's an increasing tendency to stay in bed after 5:30 in the morning. Now, I've consoled myself by telling myself that he probably went to bed very early because they didn't have all the electrical power that we do. But you know, what shaped a man like that? He wasn't very tall, all of about 5 feet, I believe. And yet one day he looked his mother in the eye and said, "Mother, can you give me a definition for sin?" And this brilliant woman, who raised two giants in the faith, John the preacher, Charles the hymnist, she said this to John: "Son, whatever weakens your reasoning, impairs the tenderness of your conscience, obscures your sense of God, or takes away your relish for spiritual things, in short, if anything increases the authority and the power of the flesh over the spirit, that to you becomes sin, however good it is in itself." No theologian has done any better than that. The underlying idea here is this: anything that refreshes you without distracting you from diminishing or destroying the final goal is a legitimate pleasure, which means, my dear friend, you must and first enunciate what your final goal is. You can never understand what a distraction is until you understand what the final goal is, what the purpose is for your life. You know, in the last few years, we've had so many consulting companies that have come on the scene, and you go through lecture after lecture trying to do better whatever it is your corporation is doing. And one of the things they keep honing in on again and again and again is clearly formulate the mission statement of this company. What is it this company is about? Write down in 1 or 2 sentences why you exist and what would be missing if you did not exist. Why did you bring this corporation into being? And I have talked to scores and scores of people who know exactly why their company exists, who have never paused long enough to write a mission statement for their own lives. It is imperative that somehow, before God, you and I take that time on that blank piece of paper and understand who we are before God, why it is we actually exist, why He has fashioned us so uniquely, with the uniqueness of the mind, the ability, the imagination, whatever it is that He's given to you. He has a purpose for your particular existence. How wonderful it would be to clearly write out what is it that purpose of your life really is about. And in the light of that, you can find out what it is that will refresh you, what it is that will rejuvenate you as you pursue that purpose. I think of the life of Samson. What a unique opportunity God had given to him. What a unique plan God had for him. His parents brought him up in all that they wanted him to understand. And yet in event after event, moment after moment, he was waylaid. And there were times when he was lying on the lap of that harlot where you sort of wanted to walk over to him as big as he was and to say to him, "Samson, what on earth are you doing here?" I came to know Christ. In fact, I have to let you know that one of the reasons I am here, because I'm really coming at the heels of so many meetings, wisdom would have told me not to come here. I'm a little weary. But one of the reasons I'm here is a fond gratitude I owe to Robert's dad, Sam Wolgemuth. I was 17 years old on a bed of suicide when I came to know Jesus Christ. And it was through the preaching of Sam Wolgemuth that I came to know the Lord. He was visiting India, and the gospel was completely foreign to me when he brought that simple message in a large, warm night in Delhi, in that auditorium, when Sam's message came through from John 3:16. The whole lot of young people that began to become part of a group. At that time, I did not know what my life meant in any way until I had found the author of my life. Several of my friends began a very close walk with Christ, and along with them, I made that my pursuit too. The book of Romans became that fundamental book of study in my life, how the grace of God had rescued this alienated spirit. There were a handful of young people, though, who weren't going to take this seriously. I still remember on a couple of nights walking forward to an invitation to totally commit my life to Christ, still not knowing what it meant. There were a couple of young people there who sort of jeered at this a bit did not quite affirm us in what we were doing. Their eyes were set in different directions. I left India when I was 20 and made my home in Canada, now in the United States. About 20 some years after I had left, I was speaking in my home city of New Delhi when a woman called me and said, "Ravi, do you remember me?" And I did remember her. She said, "My daughters were with you as part of a young people's group." I said, "Yes." "How are they doing? I haven't seen them in a couple of decades." She said, "Would you come and visit, please? I really need somebody to come and pray by the bedside of my older daughter." And she named her. She said, "You have to be prepared that you're going to see a very sorry sight." I got into the taxi and went over. And there lay this young woman, completely emaciated, just a bag of bones with the skin tied taut around it, all kinds of tubes into her nostrils and intravenous and so on. And I looked and I said, "What's happened here?" And she said, "Well, she and I got into a terrific argument about 1.5 years ago. She slammed the bathroom door shut and tried to commit suicide, leaving her husband and her 2 children and us in this state now. She has been lying in a hospital for months, and now here, we're just waiting for her to die. That's all her life amounts to." I stood there watching her breathe heavily, completely out of it. I called her by name, bent over, hadn't spoken, as I said, for so long. And all of a sudden, the body just got restless and writhed and moaned and groaned with guttural sounds. And pity just rose up to the top of my heart. I didn't even know if she understood who I was, recognized the voice. And I walked away from there, got into the taxi to head back. And I thought to myself, an awful lot has happened in these couple of decades. And the one single thought that kept coming into my mind was, what are you doing in this condition? With all the blessing God has given to you and to me, may I speak to you directly. There are some places you and I ought not to go. There are some things you and I ought not to entertain with our eyes. There are some experiences we ought not to reach out and touch, because almost like a paper-thin cut that can communicate dreadful diseases into the body, there are choices we may make that may seem rather innocuous in the beginning, which can be devastating in the long run, till you yourself will be asking yourself the question, what am I doing here? What am I doing in this condition? God has given us an enormous wealth of grand pleasure to legitimately enjoy. I will get to that as we close. But here's that principle number 1. Anything that refreshes you without diminishing you, distracting you, or destroying your final goal is a legitimate pleasure. Take some moments if you haven't already done it. I've no doubt many of you already have. Etch it, carve it, put it into your mind. This is my goal in life. And anything that distracts me from this goal or diminishes that goal, I'm going to consider an illicit pleasure in my life. It's hard, but it's a pursuit that brings all the thrill and all the delight that God has intended. An awful lot has happened in these couple of decades. And the one single thought that kept coming into my mind was, what are you doing in this condition? With all the blessing God has given to you and to me, may I speak to you directly. There are some places you and I ought not to go. There are some things you and I ought not to entertain with our eyes. There are some experiences we ought not to reach out and touch, because almost like a paper-thin cut that can communicate dreadful diseases into the body, there are choices we may make that may seem rather innocuous in the beginning, which can be devastating in the long run, till you yourself will be asking yourself the question, what am I doing here? What am I doing in this condition? God has given us an enormous wealth of grand pleasure to legitimately enjoy. I will get to that as we close. But here's that principle number 1. Anything that refreshes you without diminishing you, distracting you, or destroying your final goal is a legitimate pleasure. Take some moments if you haven't already done it. I've no doubt many of you already have. Etch it, carve it, put it into your mind. This is my goal in life. And anything that distracts me from this goal or diminishes that goal, I'm going to consider an illicit pleasure in my life. It's hard, but it's a pursuit that brings all the thrill and all the delight that God has intended. Second principle is the principle in 2 Samuel 23. David is at Adullam. The Philistines have closed in upon his home city of Bethlehem. And David is walking around waiting for this night of a serious skirmish with the Philistine army. And as he is walking, there's a wistful thought that comes into his mind. Oh, if only I had a drink from my well in Bethlehem. How wonderful it would be to have that refreshing water. Many of you will identify with it. You lead busy lives. Time and time again, I have thought miles away from home, boy, wouldn't it be great just to sleep in my bed tonight? Wouldn't it be great just to hear the voice of my little one tonight? Wouldn't it be great just to put my arm around my wife tonight? Wouldn't it be great just to have a plate of curry and rice tonight? That's what David says, oh, for a glass of water from my well, nothing outlandish, but very human. This is a war. It'd be wonderful if I could walk over to my well and have that cool drink of water, the touch of home. 3 of his very close military guards heard him, and they loved David. They got into a cloak and dagger plan, got behind the Philistine garrison, got to the well, got the water, filled up that pitcher, and brought it to David. Ta-da, here it is, David said, what's this? We heard you. You wanted some water from your well. David, here it is. You guys have got to be kidding. No? How did you get it? Don't ask. We got it. This is water from your well in Bethlehem. David is ecstatic. He picks up that pitcher, about to put it to his mouth. He says, no, I can't do this. And he pours it onto the ground. Why? Any pleasure that jeopardizes the sacred right of another may well be an illicit pleasure. Any pleasure that jeopardizes the sacred right of another may well be an illicit pleasure. He said, these fellows risked their lives. They could have been gone only because I wanted this glass of water. Now, this is a small incident, but bear with me. What do you think would have happened to all of Old Testament history if David had reacted the same way when he saw Bathsheba? A pleasure that risked the sacred right of Uriah is a pleasure he could not resist. And the principle is clear. Any pleasure that jeopardizes the sacred right of another is an illicit pleasure. For some years, I was professor at the Alliance Theological Seminary in Nyack, New York, where I was doing teaching courses in Christian apologetics and so on. And one of the things that I insisted my students do was go once a week with me. We would head off into the inner city in New York, and along that Minnesota strip, we'd never go alone. We'd go in 2s or 3s. We would go and talk to some of those whose lives had been devastated by various lifestyles, and we got involved in a youth ministry there. So I have kept in touch with that ministry. And not too long ago, the woman who runs that home, Covenant House, sent this letter around Christmas time. I read it to you. Listen to it carefully, please. She says, you're going to have trouble believing this letter. I mean, what I'm about to tell you is so strange and incredible, you'll never forget it. But please understand that every word of this story is true. I'm really praying you'll take a few minutes to read it. Thank you. She came to our front door Tuesday morning, dressed in dirty rags, holding a little aluminum paint can in her arms. From the second she stepped inside our shelter, she mystified us. Whatever she did, wherever she went, the paint can never left her hands. When Kathy sat in the crisis shelter, the can sat in her arms. She took the can with her to the cafeteria that first morning she ate, and to bed with her that first night she slept. When she stepped into the shower, the can was only a few feet away. When the tiny homeless girl dressed, the can rested alongside her. I'm sorry, this is mine, she told our counselors whenever we asked her about it. This can belongs to me. Do you want to tell me what it is, Kathy? I'd ask. No, not today, she said, not today. When Kathy was sad or angry or hurt, which happened a lot, she took her paint can to a quiet dorm room on the 3rd floor. Many times on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, I'd pass by her room and watch her rock gently back and forth the can in her arms. Sometimes she'd talk to the paint can in low whispers. I've been around troubled kids all my life. Over 41,000 homeless kids will come to our shelters this year. I'm used to seeing them carry stuffed animals. Some of the roughest, toughest kids at Covenant House have a stuffed animal. Every kid has something, needs something to hold. But a paint can? I could feel alarm bells ringing in my head. Early this morning, I decided to accidentally run into her again. Would you like to join me for breakfast, Kathy? I said, oh, that would be great, sister, she said. For a few minutes, we ate, sat in a corner of our cafeteria, talking quietly over the din of 150 ravenous homeless kids. Then I took a deep breath and plunged into it. All right, Kathy, That's a nice scan. What's in it? For a long time, she didn't answer. She rocked back and forth, her hair swaying across her shoulders. Then she looked over at me with tears in her eyes and said, "It's my mother." "What do you mean it's your mother?" "It's my mother's ashes," she said. "I went and got them from the funeral home. See, I even asked them to put a label right there on the side. It has her name on it." Kathy held the can up before my eyes. A little label on the side chronicled all that remained of her mother: date of birth, date of death, name. That was it. Then Kathy pulled the can close and hugged it. "I never really knew my mother, sister," Kathy told me. "I mean, she threw me in the garbage 2 days after I was born." We checked Kathy's story. Sure enough, the year Kathy was born, the New York papers ran a story saying that the police had found a little infant girl in a dumpster. And yes, it was 2 days after Kathy was born. "I've ended up living in a lot of foster homes, mad at my mother," Kathy said. "But then I decided I was going to try to find her. I got lucky, sister. Someone knew where she was living. I went to her house. She wasn't there," she said. "My mother was in the hospital. She had AIDS and she was dying. I went to the hospital and I got to meet her the day before she died. My mother told me she loved me, sister. She told me she really loved me." We double-checked Kathy's story. Every word was true. I reached out and hugged Kathy, and she cried in my arms for a long time. It was tough getting my arms around her because she just wouldn't put the paint can down, but she didn't seem to mind. I know I didn't. I saw Kathy again a couple hours ago eating dinner in our cafeteria. She made a point to come up and say hi. I made a point to give her an extra hug. I felt like crying tonight. I can't seem to stop feeling this way. I guess this story, this whole horrible, sad, unreal mess has gotten to me tonight. I guess that's why I just had to write you this letter. When I read something like that, as I gathered our kids around in our family and we read it around on Christmas Eve night, to think of the many who probably would multiply their lives this same way. There's a sense of self-exoneration that comes in. I'd never do that to my children. I wouldn't put them in a dumpster. I wouldn't walk away from them. I wouldn't leave them. And under God's grace, I trust that would never happen. But then a strange subtlety comes in as I measure my life. And I think of the number of months and hours I have been away from them. And I'm only so grateful to God that He gave to me a wife that nurtured, nourished 3 beautiful children. Under His grace, we pray for every day. But I do want to say this to you, ladies and gentlemen, as sincere as we may be, as defined as we may be in how to succeed in life, we may inadvertently put them aside and forget they need us as much as they really do. They speak in symbols. They don't always speak in open words. After the Columbine shooting, the next week our son Nathan asked to go to a mall on his way back home, and my wife just said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, you may be mad at me, but I want to do something." She said, "What's it, son?" "Something I'll be glad to hear you tell me." He says, "Well, I want to go and buy a necklace and put it around my neck. And I want to get a pendant saying 13 to remind me of the 13 kids that were killed, or 12 kids and the teacher that were killed at Columbine, to always remind me how bold some of them were in testifying for Christ, so that I would never lose my courage when I'm asked the question of what I really believe." You see, nobody looking at that necklace knows what it means to Nathan. They speak in subtle terms. I just have to wonder how many tragedies our nation would avoid if dads particularly, and dads and mums, did not cast aside their children along the way. Not in such dramatic fashion, it doesn't take that, but in ways where we pursue other priorities and other things, so that the years come and the years go and they've grown up, and then we find out some of the most shaping years have suddenly eluded us. I encourage you, my dear friend, I know this is not new news to you. Build a home and a life where these values are clearly before you, because that child, long after you and I realize, may yearn for that embrace and may yearn for those words. And in Covenant House, where I spent so much of my time, some of them came from the best of the homes you'd ever have wanted to hear. I still remember sitting on the floor hearing some of their stories. Guard it, Principle number 1, anything that refreshes you without distracting you from your ultimate goal is a legitimate pleasure. Principle number 2, any pleasure that jeopardizes the sacred right of another is an illicit pleasure. And I'll just mention the third. It is not the most aesthetic verse in the Bible, but it is saying it like it is. Solomon, Proverbs 25:16. If you find honey, eat just enough of it, too much of it, and you will vomit. Here's the principle. Any pleasure, however good, if not kept in balance, will distort reality or destroy appetite. Any pleasure, however good, if not kept in balance, will distort reality or destroy appetite. Keep your life in balance. The best of pleasures have a shelf life and you walk away from them. God alone is the perpetual novelty. May I leave with you, my time's gone, and rightly so. But let me just leave with you 3 closing applications. Application number 1, pleasure for pleasure's sake will leave you empty. Pleasure for pleasure's sake will leave you empty. Pleasure must only be a means. It can never be an end in itself. When we were in Hong Kong 2 years ago, the gentleman who invited me there, Thomas Kwok, listed by USA Today as one of the 10 wealthiest men in the world. Thomas invited me to speak to the Diamond Collar Group in Hong Kong. Thomas and his brother had just bought a piece of property in Hong Kong for $6 billion. That's the kind of financial empire in which they live. First night we sat across a table in Hong Kong while he was hosting us for dinner, and I said, Thomas, what brought you to Jesus Christ? He said, I was driving home one day from my corporation here, and I looked at my wife Ingrid and I said, I've got everything. I am still so empty. I must need God. Do you know what he did? His wife said, you know, there's a church near one of our apartment buildings. We won't have to pay for parking if we go to that church. Now I know why he became a billionaire. It was a Wednesday night. There was a discipleship meeting going on. Nicky Gumbel's discipleship training course was going on. He began to go Wednesday night after Wednesday night. No great evangelistic sermon was preached. I think he said by the 3rd or the 4th week, on the end of a Wednesday night, he said, this is what I need. I need God. See, pleasure for pleasure's sake will ultimately leave you empty. Only God, as I said, the perpetual novelty. Secondly, and quickly, there is a place for legitimate pleasure. I was looking over your names last night before I went to bed, praying for each one of you, some whom I know, some whom I don't. And one thing that intrigued me was to see the names of the books that meant a lot to you. I was deeply disappointed to see mine wasn't there. But I just said, Lord, it must have been sold out when they went to buy it. No, I commend you. I commend you for the books and names I saw. Yancey, Lewis, and went right down the line looking at the titles. I think that's wonderful. I commend you for that. Keep up your life of reading. C.S. Lewis in Screwtape Letters makes this comment. When the senior devil is training a junior devil to waylay a man who's on the verge of becoming a Christian, the senior devil says, go and keep him away from the enemy being God. So the junior devil goes and tries to distract the man. But after a few weeks, he comes back and says, I'm sorry, he crossed over to the side of the enemy. And the senior devil said, what happened? He said, well, he did 2 things every day, and we lost him in the process. He said, what did he do? He said, well, every morning he would get up in the morning and go for a nice long walk and just enjoy the walk, nothing more than that. And every day, at the end of the day, he would read a good book and just enjoy the good book. The senior devil said, that's where you blew it. You should have put it into his mind to get up in the morning and do the walk for the sake of exercise. It would have become a drudgery then to him. And you should have got him to read the book so that he could quote it to somebody else. It would have become equally uninspiring. He said, you see, you allowed him to enjoy such pure pleasure that the enemy's voice became more audible within those experiences. Pure pleasure brings you within the reach of God's voice. Finally, it is this, that when you not only see that pleasure is honored by God and speaks to you, the ultimate pleasure that you and I seek is the pleasure of intimacy, where God alone is enjoyed in worship. It is worship that brings complete pleasure. And if you and I learn to worship individually, the day becomes a pleasurable one because there's a cohesiveness from the grid of which every other pleasure is interpreted. May I just close with this story? I'll be a minute or two, please forgive me, and I'll close with this story. In 1971, I was in Vietnam with a young 17-year-old man. His name was Hien. Hien was my interpreter. I was in my 20s preaching the gospel to the American soldiers and in the military hospitals, POW camps, flying from city to city, being taken courtesy American troops there. Had a wonderful time in those 4 months. It basically triggered the revival in Vietnam. And my interpreter was only 17 years old, a fine man. Many years went by, 17 years went by, I hadn't heard from him. And as I was thinking of him, praying for him each day, all of a sudden out of the blue, a telephone call came. 17 years had gone by, as I said, and he said, "Brother Ravi." I realized it was his accent. I said, "Hien, is that you?" He said, "Yes." We chatted. I said, "Hien, where are you?" He said, "I'm in Los Angeles." I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Have you got time?" I said, "I got plenty of time." He told me the story. After the communists took over, he was arrested, put into prison. And they tried to knock faith in God out of him. They worked so hard and hard and hard and rebuild Marxism into him. Finally, one day he said, "I'm not going to believe in God anymore." He said, "Ravi, you came to mind. Your messages, how I ended some of those messages on my knees. And now I was deciding that God maybe did not exist. I told myself, tomorrow morning when I wake up, I will not pray at all." I got up in the morning, I was assigned to latrine duty. I was starting to clean the latrines. And as I was cleaning the latrine, I saw a little bin with wet paper in it. And I suddenly thought I saw English on one of those papers. I hadn't read English for 18 months. Everything was in Vietnamese or French that was given to us. He said, I took that paper, there was excrement on it, I washed it off, put it into my hip pocket. I just wanted to read English. I got back that night, when the room had fallen asleep, I took out my flashlight and focused it on the piece of paper which was still damp. On the top right-hand corner, I saw Romans 8:28. I started to read, and all things work together for good to them that love God, that are called according to his purpose. He said, "Brother Ravi, I wept and wept and wept. I couldn't stop weeping." I said, "God, you didn't let me out of your reach for one day. I promised I would not pray today, but the day has not ended. And you have spoken to me in this toilet paper here, thrown into, in this paper that was used as toilet paper." He said, "I went to the commander next morning and said, 'Can you give me latrine duty again today, please?'" He said, "Every day I was collecting a page from the New Testament. The commanding officer had been given a Bible by somebody. He was using it as toilet paper, throwing it into the bin. I was washing it, and I was having my devotions at the end of each day." Finally, he managed to build a boat and escape, and 4 Viet Cong came to him and said, "Are you planning to escape?" He said, "I lied to them and said no," and they left. After they left, I said to myself, here I go again trying to build my own life on my own terms. I lied, God. He said, "I prayed a prayer I hope would never be answered." I said, if you want me to tell the truth, bring them back before we set sail. There were 53 of them who were planning to escape. Minutes before the departure, 4 Viet Cong came and said to him, grabbed him by the collar, rammed him against a wall and said, "We've heard you're trying to escape. Is that true?" He said, "Yes." "What are you going to do, put me back in jail?" They said, "No, we want to go with you." And they got onto the high seas and nearly were drowned. But these 4 men were trained in skippering ability and brought them safely to Thailand. He came to the United States, finished his degree, his MBA at Berkeley. Today is serving the Lord in the West Coast. He sat in our kitchen table and said to our children, no matter how far God seems from you, don't ever forget that his love is not far enough to reach you in the darkest moment. I feel him as intimately close anywhere now, whether it's a prison or whether it's in the success of my business. Ladies and gentlemen, at his right hand are pleasures forevermore. The intimacy he gives you is so beautiful and pure, no seduction the world has to offer will ever come close. Yes, there are principles, and only he is big enough to give you true pleasure that you may hear his voice. Thank you, Father. Thank you for your thoughts this morning. Bless these dear people here, everyone. Take them back stronger than ever before. In a darkening world, may your light shine brighter. In Jesus' name, amen.